The night of my high school graduation was supposed to be the kind of evening families talk about for years. It was held at the most prestigious country club in our town, the kind of place with white linen tablecloths, heavy silverware, and crystal chandeliers that threw golden light over everyone. For most families, it was a time to stand tall, to be proud of their children's accomplishments. For me, it became the night that changed the way I understood my place in the world. I walked in quietly, holding the small purse my mother had insisted I carry, my heart already heavy with the sense that this wasn't going to be my night. Around me, laughter echoed, parents embraced their kids, friends posed for photos, and waiters carried glasses of champagne. I spotted my family at one of the front tables. Celiora, my older sister, sat in the center like a princess at a ball. She was radiant, her hair curled perfectly, her smile broad as she spoke to relatives who crowded around her. The contrast was immediate. She belonged, and I did not. I searched the table for my name card, hoping at least I would have a place at the family's side. My eyes scanned the neat rows of calligraphy. Celiora Dreven, Mr. and Mrs. Dreven, Grandmother Crane. Finally, I saw it. My stomach tightened when I read the single word printed neatly on the card: guest. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a printing error, a careless mistake, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. My family didn't do accidents when it came to appearances. Every detail was deliberate. I stood there, frozen, holding the card. My father, Cormac, sat only a few feet away, but he never looked at me. His attention was fixed on a man beside him, discussing property deals. My mother, Isolde, noticed my hesitation and offered the kind of smile that was meant for everyone else in the room, not me. "Must be a mix-up," she said smoothly, waving her hand like it was nothing. "Don't make a fuss. Sit down." Her voice was calm, but it carried a warning. "Don't disrupt the image. Don't embarrass us." I lowered myself into the seat marked for me, the one labeled guest. A cousin leaned over from another table, his tone light, though his eyes betrayed curiosity. "Weird they wrote guest, huh? I guess someone messed up." I forced a polite smile. "Yeah, strange." But inside, the words cut deep. Being erased with one word was worse than being insulted. At least insults acknowledged your existence. The dinner began. Waiters brought plates of roasted chicken, vegetables, and bread rolls. Glasses clinked as toasts were made. Celiora's name was on everyone's lips. "She's the pride of the family," one aunt said. "Such a gem." Another whispered, "She'll carry the Dreven name so well." I chewed quietly, the food tasteless. My chair felt miles away from the laughter and warmth. To the others, I was an afterthought, invisible. I overheard one of Celiora's friends whisper, "Is she your cousin?" Celiora laughed lightly. "Something like that." My mother didn't correct her. My father didn't flinch. It was as though I had been written out of the family script altogether. I remembered something my grandmother once told me. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor, not the storm. But that night, my family was the storm, and I was left without shelter. As dinner continued, I kept my expression still, careful not to reveal the turmoil inside. My grandmother had also said, "A calm face can hide the fiercest storm." Tonight, I clung to that wisdom. Then came the moment that shattered any hope I had of simply enduring the night quietly. An older gentleman in a dark suit, a longtime business partner of my father's, approached our table. He raised his glass with a warm smile. "You must be so proud of your daughters," he said. "Two fine young women." For the briefest second, I held my breath. Maybe my father would acknowledge me, at least for show. Maybe he'd pretend, if only to save face. But instead, his voice rang clear and sharp. "We are proud of Celiora," Cormac said. "She's the one who carries our name. The other, well, she's not ours." The words landed heavier than any slap. Gasps rippled across the table. A few guests shifted awkwardly in their chairs, embarrassed on my behalf. Celiora lowered her eyes, though the corner of her lips curved in satisfaction. My mother forced a laugh, brittle and false. "He's only joking," she said quickly, but she didn't deny it. She never denied it. I felt my chest tighten, my throat dry, but my mind sharpened. They hadn't just ignored me. They had erased me in front of the people who mattered most to them. I looked down at my glass of water, forcing my hands to stay steady. Inside, my voice whispered, "They cut me out of their story, but I will write my own." The rest of the evening blurred. Toasts for Celiora, applause, and more chatter about her future. Every cheer for her was an echo of my erasure. I sat silent, my storm contained. I knew tears would give them victory, so I didn't cry. At last, I excused myself from the table. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor as I walked toward the back of the room. At the bar, rows of glasses sparkled under the chandelier. I reached for one, my fingers curling around its stem. I stared into the liquid, clear and glistening. For a moment, I thought humiliation was the worst they could do to me. But as the scent reached me, sharp and unfamiliar, a chill raced through me. I returned to the table after excusing myself, keeping my head high though my stomach churned from what my father had just said. The ballroom glowed with warm light, the sound of silverware clinking against plates filling the space, as if nothing cruel had been spoken a moment earlier. Yet I felt the words cling to me like smoke, invisible to others, but suffocating me from the inside. When I reached my seat, a glass of sparkling water already waited, condensation sliding down the stem as though it had been sitting there for a while. I lifted it slightly, and under the chandelier's golden light, the liquid shimmered oddly, less clear than I remembered. I tilted the glass, noticing the faintest cloudiness, a swirl of something that didn't belong. I leaned closer, and the faint, sharp scent reached me. Chemical, sterile, not like wine, not like water, something harsher. A thought crossed my mind that I tried to dismiss immediately, but it lingered. When you've been ignored long enough, you start to wonder if the people meant to protect you secretly wish you'd vanish. I held the glass, pretending to consider drinking. A guest walking past chuckled. "Looks like they poured you the strong stuff tonight." He kept walking, unaware of the irony. I forced a polite smile, lowering the glass to the table. My fingers trembled slightly, though I kept them steady by sheer will. For a moment, I stared across the room. My father laughed heartily with another businessman, a hand resting on the man's shoulder as if the world was his to own. My mother adjusted Celiora's necklace, beaming like she was crowning royalty. To them, I was nothing more than a shadow at the edge of the room. I lifted the glass again, hesitating, when a soft voice interrupted. "Wait, does that smell right to you?" I turned. Standing just behind me was Marlon Fitch, a teaching assistant from my school and a distant family acquaintance. She leaned slightly closer, her brow furrowed as she sniffed the air. "That's Bleach," she whispered. "Bleach." The word struck me like a slap. My stomach twisted, and for a second, my vision narrowed to the glass in my hand. My parents weren't content with humiliating me. They wanted me erased. My pulse thudded in my ears. Around us, guests laughed, toasted, and carried on with their cheerful conversations, oblivious. I set the glass down carefully, keeping my face unreadable. To show panic would give them power. My father glanced toward me briefly, his eyes cool and detached, before returning to his drink as if nothing was amiss. My mother leaned toward Celiora, fixing a loose strand of her hair, while Celiora basked in compliments. "Clumsy little sister," Celiora called across the table when she noticed me pushing the glass aside. "Can't even hold a drink without looking suspicious." Her friends giggled, echoing her contempt. I smiled faintly, refusing to let her see the tremor inside me. Eleanor Roosevelt's words echoed in my mind. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I refused to grant them that satisfaction. I kept my posture calm, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Silence became my shield. I watched, studied, and memorized every detail, their laughter, their indifference, the poisoned glass left sitting before me like a symbol of their intent. Inside, I resolved that I would not fall tonight. I would not give them the weakness they craved. My strength was not in shouting or tears. My strength would be in what I carried forward. As the evening wore on, I leaned slightly, discreetly taking the glass and slipping it into my purse beneath the tablecloth. My movements were slow, careful, invisible to the untrained eye. To everyone else, I looked like a daughter too timid to join in the fun. In truth, I was a witness securing evidence. One day, I told myself silently, this glass will speak for me when no one else would. Marlon Fitch caught the action and leaned closer again, her voice hushed. You need to keep that. Someday, you'll need proof. I met her eyes and nodded, a small gesture that sealed a pact between us without words. That glass was no longer just a drink. It was a memento and a weapon. The room remained blissfully unaware. Toasts continued, champagne corks popped, and laughter rolled like waves. My family, triumphant in their illusion, never noticed that their crime now rested in my bag. As the night drew on, I rose once more. My purse felt heavier than its size, the weight of the glass pressing against me like a hidden truth. I stepped outside into the cooler night air, the sounds of the banquet muffled behind me. The glow of the country club's windows lit the lawn, silhouettes of people laughing, drinking, and embracing casting shadows against the glass. I clutched my purse tightly, feeling the outline of the stem through the fabric. They thought they had ended me tonight, but in their arrogance, they had handed me the very proof I would one day use against them. I looked back at the glowing hall, my family still inside, laughing as though nothing had happened. That night, I stopped being their daughter. But I also stopped being afraid. Because I carried their crime with me. The ride home from the banquet was cloaked in silence, the kind that pressed on your chest heavier than shouting ever could. I sat in the back seat, clutching my purse tightly against me, feeling the weight of the glass hidden inside. The streetlights passed over the windshield in rhythm, casting brief flashes of light across my parents' faces. My father's profile was rigid, jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. My mother sat next to him, lips stretched into that same polite smile she had worn all evening, as though she had glued it in place. Celiora, beside me, basked in her glow. She leaned against the leather seat, humming lightly, replaying the compliments she had gathered throughout the evening. She turned her phone toward me once, showing off a photo of herself in the middle of the ballroom crowd. "Look how radiant I look," she whispered smugly. "Everyone said I was the star." She didn't wait for me to respond before returning to her own reflection in the glass. And I said nothing. My throat felt raw, but not from tears, those I had buried deep. It was the weight of everything unspoken, the guest card, my father's cruel declaration, and the poisoned glass I now carried. They thought their silence and erasure would break me. Instead, I sat there memorizing every detail, determined to make sense of what came next. By the time we pulled into the driveway of our home, I already knew that the night wasn't finished. Something worse was waiting. Inside, the house smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, familiar yet cold. My father didn't take off his coat. Instead, he motioned sharply with his hand. "In my office, now." His voice was flat, the kind that left no room for hesitation. I followed him down the hall, my heels tapping softly against the hardwood floor. My mother trailed behind us, silent, her face unreadable. Celiora lingered in the foyer, but I caught her satisfied grin as she pretended to scroll through her phone. When we reached the office, my father closed the door and sat behind his mahogany desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. I stared at it, confused for a moment. "What is this?" His eyes locked on mine, cold and sharp. "For clarity," he said, his tone deliberate, "you are no longer a part of our estate or our plans." I opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were documents, updated wills, contracts, all neatly signed and stamped. My name was gone. Erased. Celiora's name glowed from the pages, bold and unquestioned. My mother stood near the bookshelf, her hands clasped tightly together, saying nothing. Her silence was worse than any words. Celiora entered without knocking, her smirk widening. "So it's official," she said softly, savoring each word. "I'm the heir. You're nothing." I looked at her, then at my father. My voice broke through the heavy air. "You're doing this to your own blood?" My father's lips thinned. Blood is irrelevant when it stains the family name. I wasn't just unwanted. I was legally erased. I gripped the edge of the desk, the paper cutting into my palm. In America, wills are more than just documents. They are sacred proof of who belongs, of who carries a family forward. Tonight, my family had declared, on paper, that I didn't exist. The betrayal washed over me in waves, but beneath it, a fire began to burn. If they erased me from their history, then I would carve myself into the world's memory in ways they couldn't control. That night, after retreating to my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the glass still tucked safely in my purse. Proof. Silent, but undeniable. I wanted to believe I wasn't alone, that someone had seen what happened. My phone buzzed. It was a number I recognized. Marlon Fitch. I answered quietly, glancing toward the door. Her voice was hushed, urgent. I need you to know. I saw what they did. I smelled it too. If you need me, I'll testify. I'll tell the truth. Relief surged in me. Finally, someone outside this house willing to acknowledge reality. Thank you, I whispered, clutching the phone. You don't know what this means to me. But hope is fragile. Within days, the call came again, this time colder. Marlon's voice shook. I'm sorry, Vera. I can't help you. Your father. He has influence. He spoke to people. If I stand with you, I lose everything. I can't risk my career. The line went silent. I stared at the phone, the betrayal hitting me harder than I expected. It wasn't just my family against me. It was their reach, their power, their ability to silence even those who had seen the truth. I whispered to myself, injustice doesn't just thrive on cruelty, it thrives on silence. The house was quiet that night, but inside me, the storm roared. I packed my bag with deliberate movements, slipping the poisoned glass carefully inside, wrapping it in fabric so it wouldn't shatter. I looked once more around the room where I had grown up, realizing it had never truly been home. I walked down the stairs slowly, unseen, the silence of the house pressing against me. My parents were asleep, or pretending to be. Celiora's door was cracked open just enough for her to peek, her eyes glinting with triumph as she watched me leave. That night, I became a ghost in my own family, but a ghost who carried proof, waiting for the day to haunt them back. The weeks after graduation stretched long and heavy. I still lived in the house, but every corner reminded me I wasn't meant to remain. I ate at the table, but they placed me at the far end, separated by empty chairs like I was contagious. Conversation passed over me as if I weren't present at all. My father, Cormac, was constantly buried in phone calls about business ventures. My mother, Isolde, entertained guests with her perfect hostess smile, yet never once turned to me to introduce me as her daughter. Celiora thrived, of course. She carried herself as though the entire house had been built only for her, moving through the rooms like a queen, her words dripping with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Relatives dropped by to praise her, business partners toasted her, and even neighbors looked at her with admiration. I was the shadow in daylight, hovering near enough to see, but never included. When people ignore you long enough, I thought one evening as I pushed food around my plate, you begin to feel like a ghost still trapped in the sunlight. That ghost-like existence became clearer when I wandered into the living room one afternoon. On the coffee table sat the family album, leather-bound and well-kept. My mother had always guarded it like a treasure. Out of curiosity, or perhaps desperation for some sign that I still existed, I opened it. The first pages looked normal, my parents' wedding, Celiora as a baby, smiling grandparents. But when I reached the years of my own childhood, I froze. My pictures were gone. Entire pages had been cut, leaving behind uneven edges. In their place were enlarged photos of Celiora. Celiora with ribbons in her hair. Celiora on her first day of school. Celiora in dance costumes. I turned more pages. The few photos of me that had survived were cropped so tightly you could only see a blur of my face in the background. In one, a party picture, the scissors had sliced clean across my body, leaving Celiora alone in the frame. I carried the album to my mother, holding it open. "Where are my pictures?" I asked, my voice steady though my hands shook. She looked up from arranging flowers, her tone even. "We wanted consistency in presentation. Don't be dramatic." "Consistency?" I whispered. "You cut me out." She placed a flower into the vase, avoiding my eyes. "Some memories aren't worth displaying." Her words pierced deeper than the scissors had. I wasn't just excluded legally anymore. I was being erased from memory. I closed the album and placed it back on the table. But in that moment I knew, this house no longer held room for me. Celiora noticed my expression later and smiled. "Don't pout, little sister," she said, as her friends laughed behind her. "You know this house was always mine. You're just temporary here. Soon, you'll be gone." Her words hung in the air, and I realized she was right. And I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. Still, my family wasn't finished with me. One evening, Cormac hosted a dinner with close associates. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the long table lined with expensive wine and polished silver. From the staircase above, unseen, I watched as they toasted to Celiora. "To Celiora, the future of the Dreven family," one man declared, raising his glass. Applause echoed, laughter swelled, and my mother's face shone with pride as though she had birthed perfection itself. Celiora smiled graciously, soaking in the praise, her posture flawless. I gripped the railing, fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. My existence had been fully denied, not only erased in papers and albums, but now replaced entirely with her. Sometimes the most painful goodbyes, I thought as I turned away from the staircase, are the ones never said out loud. That night, I slipped into the living room once more, staring at the album one last time. I whispered to myself, if they want me gone, they'll get their wish. But they'll never erase what I carry. And with that, I knew leaving wasn't running away. It was preparing for the fight they never saw coming. The night I left my family's house, the mansion still glowed with music and chatter from the celebration inside. I walked down the driveway with only a single bag on my shoulder and the glass wrapped carefully in a sweater at the bottom. Each step away from those doors felt like shedding a piece of skin, but not in pain, more like relief. I didn't slam the door or cry. I just slipped into the night, quiet, determined, unseen. Behind me, laughter continued for Celiora, as if the house itself had never known I existed. The air outside was cooler, and the street stretched long and dark under the faint yellow glow of the lamps. For the first time in years, I could hear my own footsteps clearly, unburdened by anyone else's demands. I stopped once, looked back at the lit windows, and whispered into the silence, "Sometimes you have to leave the table where love is no longer being served." Nina Simone's words rang in my head, not as a lament, but as a command. I walked into the darkness with nothing but resolve. Survival, I told myself, would be my rebellion. The next morning, I stood in line at the Greyhound station with a ticket in hand, clutching my bag close. No chauffeur, no father paying for a private car, just me, waiting to board a bus with strangers heading in every direction. As the bus pulled away from Columbus, I watched the skyline recede, the city that had been my cage becoming smaller until it was gone. The first weeks were brutal. I hopped between cheap motels, then rented a tiny room in Cincinnati. The paint peeled from the walls, and the heater rattled louder than the traffic outside. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the poisoned glass resting under my bed like a hidden ally. Each morning, I rose early, pulling on uniforms for jobs that demanded more of my body than my mind. I worked as a diner waitress, pouring coffee for truck drivers at dawn, balancing trays heavy with pancakes and eggs. At night, I scrubbed office floors, pushing a mop across empty lobbies until my arms ached. I took any work I could find, because money was the only way forward. But during breaks, I opened borrowed textbooks, scribbling notes by dim light, refusing to let exhaustion erase the thought of something greater. Celiora's name floated across the local news once in a while, her photographs at charity events, her smile plastered across society columns. While she basked in adoration, I went to bed hungry more nights than I could count. Still, I kept moving. "America glorifies the self-made story," I muttered one night as I wiped sweat from my forehead. "But no one tells you about the nights you go to bed starving just to buy tomorrow's chance." I clung to the glass. It wasn't just a relic of trauma. It was proof. Proof that I had endured something real. Proof that I could someday make them answer. I kept it wrapped carefully, moving it from one place to the next, the one possession that reminded me of what I'd survived. Months passed. My body adjusted to the exhaustion, but my heart carried a weight no shift could lighten. One night, alone in my room, I pulled out stationery I had bought at a corner store. My hands shook as I smoothed the paper flat on the table. I wrote to my parents. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't beg for money. I simply asked for acknowledgement. I told them I still existed. That despite the humiliation, despite the legal erasure, I was still their daughter. My words were steady, honest, restrained. I wrote not as a plea, but as a reminder. When I sealed the envelope and slid it into the mailbox, I whispered to myself, "Sometimes we write not to be answered, but to prove we still exist." For weeks, I checked the mail with cautious hope. Each day, my heart tightened as I scanned the letters, waiting for something, anything. Then one evening, a small white envelope appeared in my box. It was mine, the same one I had sent weeks before, now stamped with the coldest words I'd ever read. Return to sender, addressee unknown. My breath caught. My knees weakened. They hadn't just ignored me, they had deliberately marked me as non-existent. I carried the letter into the post office the next day, desperate for clarity. A kind older clerk behind the counter studied the envelope, then looked at me gently. "Ma'am, sometimes people just don't want to be found," she said softly. Her sympathy was kind, but the words cut deep. Legal disownment had been one thing. This was worse. This was spiritual death, the deliberate erasure of my identity by those who gave me life. I walked back to my room, the envelope crumpled slightly in my hand. I laid it on the table beside the glass, the two objects now side by side. The glass of bleach they had hoped would kill me, and the letter they refused to acknowledge. One physical, one symbolic, both evidence of what they had tried to erase. I sat there for a long time, staring at them both, the silence of the room filling my ears. Then I whispered, "If they erased me, then I'll write myself back into the world," louder than they ever imagined. The rejection was fuel, and fuel, once lit, burns. Years stretched between the day I walked out of that mansion and the morning I stood on the steps of my Chicago apartment, holding the keys to a place that was finally mine. Exile had carved me into someone unrecognizable even to myself. In the beginning, I worked jobs that barely paid the rent, scrubbing office buildings long after the last executive had left, waiting tables at diners where truck drivers left quarters as tips, and studying case law under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights. My body was exhausted most days, but I refused to stop. When you're unwanted at home, I told myself during those long nights, you learn to carve out a place in the world with your bare hands. By 2019, I passed the bar exam. The day the letter arrived declaring I was now an attorney, I held it for a long moment, remembering the envelope that had once returned to me, stamped addressee unknown. This one was the opposite. It acknowledged me, affirmed my existence. Soon after, I landed an associate position at a mid-tier firm in downtown Chicago. The hours were brutal, but they didn't scare me. I'd been surviving harder nights for years. My new life was lonely, but stable. I rented a modest apartment with thin walls and a kitchen too small to cook in, but it was mine. On weekends, I walked the streets of Chicago, feeling both anonymous and powerful, a survivor building something no one could erase. Survival wasn't just possible, it was transformative. One evening, as I sorted through the day's mail, an envelope caught my eye. The handwriting was familiar, though I hadn't seen it in years. My chest tightened as I tore it open. The letter began simply, "Vera, I should have spoken sooner." It was from Marlon Fitch, the teacher's assistant who had stopped me from drinking the poisoned glass that night so long ago. My hands shook as I read. She confessed the guilt that had haunted her for years, admitting she had kept notes about that evening, descriptions of the smell, the look on my father's face, even her own fear. "Silence is complicity," she wrote. "I stayed quiet because I was scared. I regret that every day. This letter is my atonement." Tears blurred the page, not from weakness, but from the strange relief of finally being acknowledged. Someone else remembered. Someone else had seen. I placed the letter on the table beside the glass and the returned envelope. 3 pieces of evidence, 3 symbols. Their attempt to erase me, their refusal to acknowledge me, and one witness who finally admitted the truth. Together, they formed a trifecta of proof that my pain had not been imagined. By 2022, the exhaustion of survival had evolved into something steadier. At the firm, I built a reputation for handling the toughest financial cases. Clients praised my precision. Colleagues admired my calm under pressure. "You never lose your cool," one partner told me. I smiled politely, but inside I thought, when you've lived through being erased, no courtroom can rattle you. I bought a modest but comfortable apartment in the city, decorating it with minimalist taste. No clutter, no extravagance, only space to breathe. Every evening when I locked the door, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Success didn't erase the scars, but it gave me leverage. An old American saying came to mind often: "The best revenge is living well." And I did live, quietly, efficiently, with purpose. Yet deep down, I knew my family still carried on pretending I didn't exist. No headline, no success would ever make them say my name. Then, in early 2023, it arrived. Another envelope, thick ivory, sealed with the Drevens family crest. My breath caught the moment I saw it. I ran my finger over the elegant calligraphy of my name, disbelief churning in my chest. Inside was an invitation to Celiora's wedding. The location, my eyes froze on the words, was the same country club where my nightmare had begun. 10 years had passed, and they were inviting me back to the scene of my humiliation. My hand trembled as I held the card. Memories flooded back. The guest name card, my father's voice saying, "She's not ours," the chemical scent of bleach from the glass. For a moment, I considered tearing the invitation to shreds, but another voice inside me rose stronger. "This is not a mistake," it said. "This is a stage." They thought they were pulling me back into their world as the erased child. They had no idea I would return not as a victim, but as the storm they never expected. That evening, I set the invitation on my desk. Beside it sat the glass and Marlon's letter. I stared at the 3 of them, my heart steady. I whispered into the quiet room. They wanted me gone. Now they'll have to face what they created. 10 years later, I was finally ready to walk back into the fire, this time carrying flames of my own. The highway stretched endlessly before me as I drove back into Ohio for the first time in 10 years. The same road that once carried me away now wound me straight back into the past. The summer evening sky shifted from blue to gold, and every mile carried memories I'd tried to bury, yet tonight, I embraced them. I wasn't the timid girl who had fled with a single bag. I was an attorney, a woman who had clawed her way back from nothing. My reflection in the rearview mirror was steady, my posture upright in my tailored black dress. Beside me, the leather briefcase rested on the passenger seat, a quiet reminder that power was no longer in their hands. It was in mine. "You cannot walk back into the lion's den as prey," I whispered to myself, recalling the words I'd rehearsed for weeks. "You walk in as fire." The country club came into view, its manicured lawns and glowing windows unchanged since that night. At the entrance, valet staff rushed forward. One opened my car door and offered me a ticket with a respectful nod. "Welcome, ma'am," he said, assuming I was one of the many VIP guests. For the first time, I didn't feel like an imposter. Inside, nerves stirred beneath my skin, but they never outweighed the steel running through me. I had come to be seen. I stepped into the grand hall, and the noise softened for a moment as eyes turned toward me. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, laughter mingled with music, and conversations paused. I didn't rush or stumble. I let silence announce me before my heels clicked against the polished floor. I didn't walk in as the erased daughter. I walked in as a woman they could no longer deny. Guests began whispering, "Who is she? She looks important." Others stared openly, intrigued. I locked eyes with a man I recognized faintly, a business acquaintance who had attended banquets with my father. He approached with a surprised smile. Chicago's own attorney, he said. I've read about your work. Didn't expect to see you here. The irony struck me. Strangers recognized my worth, while my own family had tried to erase it. I smiled politely. It seems the world remembers what families try to forget. I could feel the ripple of attention spreading. Every glance reminded me of my father's words. Power isn't given, power is walked in with. Tonight, I carried it effortlessly. Then I saw them. My father's face paled slightly when he recognized me. My mother's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, waving to a guest as if nothing had changed. Celiora's eyes narrowed, the shine of her bridal gown dulled by the fury behind her forced grin. They panicked, but they couldn't risk a scene in front of so many. My father, cornered, acted first. He guided me toward a group of influential guests with a too-wide smile. "This is a family friend," he announced. His voice was steady, but his hand gripped his glass tightly. My mother joined him, her tone sharp though wrapped in false sweetness. "Yes, she's helped us with some business here and there. Nothing more." My heart hardened. 10 years had passed, yet they still chose erasure, not behind closed doors, but here, in front of a crowd who sensed the truth. Guests exchanged confused glances. The tension was palpable. 10 years later, I thought bitterly, and they still erase me, but this time, I'm not the girl who leaves quietly. Celiora approached then, her forced smile brighter than the chandeliers. She held her bouquet close like a shield. "Didn't expect you to show up," she said in a low voice meant for me, though her lips never broke their curve. I tilted my head, calm and deliberate. "That's the thing about ghosts," I answered. "We appear when least convenient." Her husband, standing just behind her, noticed the stiffness. "Who is this?" he asked. His tone was genuine, but his question sent visible discomfort through Celiora. "She's no one," Celiora answered quickly, then caught herself. "Just someone from the past." But her words rang false. The guests watching, now curious, whispered louder. Her husband studied me with suspicion. "Funny," he said softly. "People seem to know her more than they know you." I saw it then, the crack in Celiora's perfect facade. Envy flickered across her face, quickly hidden but unmistakable. For years, she had basked in their spotlight, built her identity on being the chosen one, the perfect heir. Now, in her own wedding gown, she felt overshadowed by me, the sister they had discarded. I leaned slightly closer, keeping my voice calm. "Enjoy your night, Celiora. I'm just here to remind you. The things you try to bury never stay underground." Her eyes burned, her smile frozen for the cameras that hovered nearby. Guests shifted, their admiration sliding toward me, not her. The envy grew, feeding her unease. The evening carried on, music swelling again, but beneath it pulsed a silent war. My father avoided my gaze, but I caught his jaw tightening each time someone greeted me instead of him. My mother's polite laughter rang hollow, her hand trembling as she refilled her wine. Finally, across the hall, I locked eyes with Cormac. Neither of us moved, but the challenge was clear. I lifted my champagne glass slowly, not to drink, but to signal. I remembered. The poison, the silence, the night they had tried to erase me. "They thought they buried me 10 years ago," I whispered inside my mind. Tonight, I came back to prove I was never gone. The ballroom shimmered with light, chandeliers casting golden patterns across polished floors. Music drifted through the air, laughter rose from groups of guests, and glasses clinked with celebratory toasts. But beneath it all, there was something heavier, an unease I could feel in my bones. I stood quietly, my fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute, though I hadn't taken a sip. The room buzzed with life, but to me it sounded muffled, as though I were listening through water. My eyes tracked across the hall. My father, Cormac, moved with ease between businessmen, shaking hands, laughing louder than necessary, his mask of control intact. My mother, Isolde, wore her perfected smile, gliding from one guest to the next, whispering compliments, brushing off questions with elegance. And at the center of it all, Celiora glowed in her wedding gown, pearls catching the light, guests fawning over her like she was some untouchable figure. They thought time erased me, I told myself, watching them parade, but ghosts don't vanish, they wait. The flute in my hand was more than decoration. It was a symbol, a reminder. I hadn't come to drink. I'd come to speak. And as the chatter swirled around me, guests began to notice my presence. Heads turned, whispers traveled. "Who is she?" one voice asked softly. Another said, "She looks like family, but why haven't we seen her before?" The pressure built. I knew the moment was coming. Then, during a toast, silence descended briefly as everyone raised their glasses toward Celiora. It was then that I lifted mine and let the words slip, calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Not ours. The room froze. Glasses lowered slowly, eyes turned toward me, and for a moment the air itself seemed to hold its breath. "That's what you told the world about me," I said louder, my gaze fixed on my father. "That I was not yours." Murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd. Guests exchanged shocked looks, some leaning closer to one another in disbelief. Celiora stiffened, her painted smile faltering. My father's face tightened, but he forced a chuckle. "She's being dramatic," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "The truth isn't drama," I answered calmly. "It's a wound you can't keep hidden forever." The silence deepened. For years, they had controlled the narrative, but now, with an audience watching, the cracks began to show. Guests whispered more urgently, some unsettled, others clearly demanding clarity. Celiora tried to seize control, clapping her hands lightly. "It's time for the first dance," she announced, her voice a pitch too high, straining to shift focus back to herself. But eyes didn't move to her. They stayed on me. My mother leaned close as she passed by, her smile unbroken, but her words sharp as glass. "Leave before you ruin everything," she hissed. I didn't flinch. "This isn't ruin," I whispered back. "This is revelation." I straightened, letting my voice carry. "Out here, truth eventually finds its way to the microphone," I said, echoing an old American belief I had carried with me. And now, I was living it. The murmur grew louder, anticipation rippling across the crowd. It was time. I walked toward the head table, my steps measured, my heart steady. Guests parted slightly, curiosity pulling them aside as I reached the center of the hall. "You want to know what kind of family this is?" I asked the room. "Let me tell you a story." Gasps punctuated the silence as I continued. 10 years ago, at my graduation dinner, they handed me a glass. Inside was bleach. The room erupted in audible shock. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a cruel metaphor, but I reached into my bag and pulled out the carefully preserved glass, wrapped for a decade in cloth. The stem glinted under the lights. "This," I said firmly, holding it up, "was meant to erase me." The whispers exploded into chaos. Guests clutched at their pearls, some shaking their heads in horror. Others looked at my parents with outright disgust. Then, a voice rose from the crowd. Marlon Fitch stepped forward, older now but steady, her eyes meeting mine. "She's telling the truth," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I smelled it that night. I stopped her before she drank. The band stopped playing. The laughter died completely. Outrage spread through the room like fire. My father's face was stone, his jaw locked, his glass untouched in front of him. My mother's color drained, her carefully applied mask slipping. Celiora trembled, her fingers gripping the edge of the tablecloth until her knuckles whitened. "For years," I said, lowering the glass onto the table with deliberate calm. "I thought silence kept me safe. Tonight, silence finally broke." The hall was frozen in disbelief. Every smile had vanished. Every eye was on me. The band sat still, instruments idle, as if afraid to resume. My father's mask cracked, his composure slipping as the truth hung heavy in the air. My mother turned pale. Celiora trembled, and I knew the balance of power had shifted. "They tried to erase me with poison," I said softly, my words echoing louder in the silence than any shout could. "Tonight, I erased their silence with truth, The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the band's instruments resting in their stands. After my revelation about the bleach, people no longer laughed or clapped. Instead, they whispered nervously, their voices darting through the air like quick shadows. Some glanced at me with empathy, others with judgment. I saw heads turn toward my father, searching for his reaction, for any explanation that could soften what they had just heard. Celiora clung to her husband's arm, her nails pressing deep into the fabric of his tuxedo sleeve. Isolda, my mother, looked pale, her face as stiff as porcelain under the chandelier's light. My father, Cormac, forced a smile, the kind you wear when the mask is cracking, but you refuse to let anyone see the break. He raised his glass slightly, pretending nothing had happened, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. "In America," I said softly, my voice carrying in the silence. "They say sunlight is the best disinfectant." Tonight, I let in the sun. The silence grew heavier, but I knew this was only the beginning. Truth had barely broken the surface. I stepped forward and placed my briefcase on the head table. The click of the latches echoed in the quiet. From inside, I pulled out a stack of papers, legal documents I had kept for years, original copies, notarized, evidence of what had been done to me. I laid them out carefully, each page like a blade cutting through the illusion of perfection my family had built. "Here's what family loyalty looks like," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. Signed and erased. Gasps spread through the room as guests leaned forward to see. Some covered their mouths, others whispered furiously. "They cut me out not because I was unworthy," I continued, my gaze steady on my father, "but because I was inconvenient." Cormac stepped forward, his tone sharp but controlled. "These are private family matters," he said. "They have no place here." I met his eyes without blinking. "Private until you poisoned a child at her graduation dinner." The words struck like a hammer. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, murmurs, some voices outright exclaiming. People who had wanted to believe this was a petty sibling rivalry now understood it was darker, documented, undeniable. The weight of realization spread through the guests. This wasn't drama. This was betrayal, written in ink, signed, sealed, and hidden until now. My father's jaw tightened, veins standing out along his temple. He tried to hold his composure, but his anger showed in the way his hand clenched around the edge of the table. My mother leaned close to him, whispering harshly, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Celiora's mask cracked entirely. She shouted at me from across the room. "You're lying! You're twisting everything!" Her voice broke halfway through, panic and jealousy colliding in every word. I turned toward her slowly, letting silence work before I spoke. They thought they owned the narrative, but I owned the paper trail. The crowd was split. Some nodded, their faces set in outrage at my family. Others whispered uncertainly, too tangled in loyalty or disbelief to choose sides. But I knew the tide had shifted. For the first time, the truth was no longer mine alone to carry. I reached once more into my bag and pulled out the glass, the very one I had wrapped and preserved for 10 years. I set it gently on the head table. Its presence was louder than any shout. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some people stood to get a better view. Others whispered prayers under their breath. The sight of that glass, a symbol of attempted erasure, was undeniable. "You can rewrite albums," I said, my voice even. "Edit wills, silence witnesses, but glass doesn't lie." From the side of the hall, Marlon Fitch stepped forward again, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I smelled it that night. I stopped her from drinking. That glass is real." The atmosphere shifted. This no longer felt like a wedding. It felt like a trial. My family was no longer the celebrated hosts. They were the accused. Guests pulled out their phones. Some began recording, knowing what they were witnessing was more than scandal. It was the collapse of an empire built on lies. "Proof isn't power," I said, staring at my father. "Proof is nothing until you dare to show it. Tonight, I laid it bare." The room erupted into murmurs. People spoke louder now, some in outrage, some in disbelief. The illusion was shattered, and no one could put it back together. My father clenched his fists at his sides. He leaned toward me, his voice low but filled with venom. "You don't know what you've started." I held his stare, unflinching. My heart beat steady, not with fear but with certainty. I knew exactly what I started, the undoing of your perfect empire. The ballroom was no longer a place of joy. It had turned into a cauldron of whispers, gasps, and restless eyes. Phones were lifted discreetly, their tiny red lights blinking as they recorded every word and gesture. Reporters who had been invited to cover the grandeur of Celiora's wedding now smelled blood in the water. Influencers angled their cameras, capturing what was quickly becoming the scandal of the year. I stood steady, my documents laid bare, the glass gleaming under the chandeliers like an indictment no one could deny. My father, Cormac, tried to keep his posture straight, his voice controlled as he said, "This is all a family misunderstanding, a moment exaggerated for effect." The room did not buy it. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't convinced. Some had already begun whispering to one another. Misunderstandings don't come with notarized signatures and bleach stains. My reflection was sharp. The perfect family they had displayed for decades was cracking in real time, its collapse public and merciless. I knew then there was no turning back. One by one, the power my father had built began to slip. Guests excused themselves quietly, their chairs scraping against the polished floor as they stood and walked away from the Dreven table. The most powerful business associates, the men and women my father depended on to keep his empire thriving, drifted to other corners of the room. Their murmurs followed them. If they could do that to their own child. Desperation crept into Cormac's voice. He raised it louder, a mistake he rarely made in public. "Enough of this circus!" His tone, instead of commanding respect, cracked his veneer further. His anger rang as desperation, not authority. My mother, Isolde, clung to her last weapon, her smile. But even that faltered. I watched her lips tremble, her painted composure dissolving as tears streaked down her face under the bright ballroom lights. She dabbed at them with a napkin, but the stain of her mascara betrayed her. Celiora, in her gown, tried to reclaim dignity, but her words turned shrill. "Don't listen to her," she pleaded with the crowd. "She's jealous, she always has been." Her voice, filled with envy and panic, made her sound more like a bitter child than the poised bride she wanted to be. The contrast was too obvious. Guests shook their heads, disgust mingled with pity. The empire my father built, I thought, isn't falling because I pushed it, it's collapsing under its own lies. Cormac turned on me, fury sharpening his voice. "She's a bitter liar seeking attention. Don't let her poison this night." He looked around, searching for allies, for nods of support. But the eyes that once followed him now avoided his gaze. Men who once owed him favors found their glasses suddenly interesting. Women who once praised Isolde clutched their pearls and whispered into their husbands' ears. Finally, a guest spoke bluntly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Then why does she have the documents? Why does she have the glass?" Cormac froze. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. His power, once untouchable, was slipping through his fingers like sand. In America, reputation is currency. My father's account had just been overdrafted in front of the people who mattered most. I realized in that moment I didn't need to scream, didn't need to beg or plead. The truth was already visible. The crowd saw it, felt it, and judged it. My role wasn't to convince them. It was simply to stand. Then a voice rose above the chaos. Calm, strong, certain. "I've worked with Ms. Quill," it said. Heads turned. Stepping forward was Darian Holt, a respected attorney and businessman, known across Chicago for his integrity. He adjusted his tie, his presence alone commanding the attention of the room. "If she says this happened," he continued, "I believe her, and so will the law." The room erupted in gasps. People leaned in closer, murmuring his name. A public figure siding with me changed everything. The scales tilted visibly. Cormac's face tightened, his jaw a clenched stone. Celiora's sobs grew louder, muffled behind her trembling hands. Isolde collapsed back into her chair, the strength drained from her body. Allies shifted toward me. Guests who had hesitated now nodded, their loyalties realigning as fast as their social instincts could adapt. My father's empire, built on fear and silence, was disintegrating. For the first time, I thought, I wasn't fighting alone. The silence broke wide open. The wedding no longer felt like a wedding. It had become a tribunal, and I was its quiet judge. Every piece of proof I laid out, every word spoken in my defense, was another strike against the facade of the Dreven name. At last, I raised my champagne glass. I didn't drink. I lifted it high, steady, deliberate. My voice cut through the hush. To truth, the one air you couldn't erase. Applause erupted. It started small, then grew louder, bolder, as guests stood from their seats and clapped. Some cheered. The ballroom thundered with the sound of loyalty shifting from lies to truth. My father's empire had collapsed, not in silence, but in humiliation witnessed by hundreds. Justice didn't whisper tonight. It roared. The night dragged on long after the applause had quieted. I walked slowly through the hall, my heels echoing against the marble floor, observing the aftermath of what I had unleashed. Clusters of guests leaned into each other, whispering furiously, their eyes darting back and forth between me and my family. Some pointed openly toward the Dreven table, their faces twisted in disbelief. Others held their phones in hand, their screens lit up, documenting everything and pushing it out into the world. The buzzing of notifications was everywhere. Social media was already flooding with the scandal. I overheard one young man mutter, "This is trending already. It's all over Twitter." Another woman added in shock, "Headlines will have this by morning." I breathed deeply, the weight of release mixing with exhaustion. For years, the fight had been mine alone, buried under silence and disbelief. But now, I could feel the shift. Justice today didn't just happen in courtrooms, it happened in hashtags, headlines, and live streams. What my family had done in secret was now spilling into the light, spreading faster than they could stop it. My story was no longer just mine. It belonged to anyone who had ever been erased, silenced, or cast out by the people meant to protect them. The sense of victory was tempered with fatigue. I knew the fight wasn't finished, but for the first time, I wasn't carrying the burden alone. Cormac's business partners approached him discreetly at the far end of the hall. Their voices were quiet, but the message carried. I caught fragments as I walked past. "We can't be associated with this." Another man added firmly, "Our investments will have to be withdrawn immediately." I paused, just for a moment, watching the lines deepen on my father's face. The mask of control was slipping further with each word he heard. My mother, desperate, clutched the arm of a longtime society friend. "Please, you know me," she begged softly, her voice trembling. "This is all a misunderstanding." The woman pulled back, her expression cold. "Reputation is all we have, Isolde. Yours is gone." With that, she turned and walked away. Celiora broke down completely, tears smudging her perfectly painted face. She clutched at her father's arm, her voice rising. "You promised me everything. You said this day would be perfect. Now I have nothing but shame." Cormac's voice was a low growl. "You still have our name." Celiora pulled back sharply, her cry carrying across the hall. "That name is poison!" The words hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. Guests turned, their eyes wide, their judgments cemented. The Dreven family's downfall was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. My father finally turned to me. For the first time in my life, his face wasn't carved from stone. There was something softer, cracked, almost human. His voice when he spoke carried a fracture I had never heard before. "Maybe I was wrong," he said, haltingly. "Maybe I went too far." I stood still, waiting. I had imagined this moment countless times. I had waited years to hear words like these. Yet when they finally came, they felt hollow. They weren't born of love or recognition. They were born of defeat. Regret is not repentance, I thought. Regret is fear wearing softer clothes. My mother, her mascara streaked down her face, stepped forward. "We didn't mean to," she began, her voice breaking. I lifted a hand gently, cutting her off. My silence spoke louder than any reply could. Their words, their excuses, meant nothing to me now. I turned to the room, to the witnesses of my story, and felt clarity sweep over me. My journey from the erased child to the woman standing here tonight had not been easy, but it had made me whole in ways they could never take away. "I don't need your inheritance," I said aloud, my voice steady. "I don't need your name. I don't need your approval. I have myself." Guests nearby nodded. Some even applauded softly, a few offering quiet smiles of respect. They understood because what I had said wasn't just about me. It was about anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Success, I realized, was sweetest when built with your own hands. The applause wasn't for vengeance. It was for survival, for truth, for standing unbroken when others had tried to bury me. I turned back to the table, to the family that had cast me out. Slowly, I reached for the glass, the one I had carried for 10 years. For a long moment, I held it, remembering everything it represented. The night they tried to erase me, the silence that followed, the years of exile. Then I set it down on the table. Not as a burden, not as a wound, as evidence. As a permanent reminder of what they had done, something they could never escape no matter how many pictures they cut from albums or wills they rewrote. Without another word, I turned away. I stepped out into the cool Ohio night. The air was crisp, the noise of the hall fading behind me until it was just a distant hum. The stars stretched wide above me, brighter than I remembered. I whispered to myself, "I carried their silence long enough. Now I carry only myself." The night wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of life without their shadows. The ballroom was nearly empty, but the weight of the night still pressed against the walls. Chandeliers that once sparkled over laughter now shone on stained linens, overturned glasses, and broken illusions. Guests trickled out, some whispering as they clutched their coats, others leaving in silence, their phones buzzing with headlines already tearing across the internet. I stood near the doorway, watching the remnants of my family. Cormac sat slumped, his posture a far cry from the commanding figure he once projected. His hands trembled as he pressed them against his temples. My mother, Isolde, avoided all eye contact, hiding behind her shawl as though fabric could shield her from the humiliation. Celiora, once the star of the night, wept openly, mascara smeared into black trails down her cheeks. Inside my chest, my heart was steady. The storm had passed, but its echoes still rattled through the hall. Reputation burns faster than paper, I thought. Once it catches fire, there is no saving it. But I wasn't finished. Tonight wasn't just about exposing them. Tonight was about closing the chapter they had written for me and starting the one I would write for myself. I walked back toward the center of the room. The few remaining guests fell silent, their attention snapping toward me. I could feel their curiosity, their hunger for a final word, and I had one left to give. I straightened my back, set down my purse, and looked directly at my father. 10 years ago, you told the world I wasn't yours, I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Tonight, I tell the world, I was never yours, and I never needed to be. Gasps rippled across the room. I pulled a folder from my briefcase, setting it firmly on the table. This isn't just about humiliation. It isn't just about a poisoned glass. It's about crimes, documented, prepared, ready for court. Fraud, inheritance tampering, attempted harm. Eyes widened, some guests clutching their chests. This wasn't a daughter venting wounds. This was an attorney delivering charges. The line between personal and legal had blurred, and I was standing on the side of law. I wasn't just a survivor, I continued, my eyes never leaving Cormac's. I became the architect of your reckoning. The room stilled into awe. Some applauded softly, not out of excitement, but out of recognition. They knew this empire was beyond repair. Isolde crumbled first. Her hands reached across the table, trembling. "Please, we're still your parents," she whispered, her voice hoarse with desperation. Celiora snapped, her fury untamed. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, turning on Cormac. "You promised me perfection. You let her take this from me." Cormac sat in silence, the weight of defeat heavy in his shoulders. Finally, he lifted his head, his voice thin. "What do you want from us?" I felt the question hang in the air. For years, I had asked myself the same thing. Recognition, love, a place at the table. But as I looked at them now, broken, bitter, desperate, I realized I wanted none of it. "Nothing," I said quietly. "That's the point. I wanted a family. But when you refused, I built a life instead." Some guests nodded, others dabbed at their eyes. They understood. Family isn't always chosen, but it must always be earned. Power, I reflected silently, is not in the blood that rejects you. Power is in the life you refuse to surrender. Slowly, I reached for my purse. I lifted the bleach-stained glass one last time. The glass that had haunted me, the evidence I had carried like a wound for 10 long years. I set it carefully on the head table, in front of them. Not as a plea, not as a burden, as a verdict. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned, every step deliberate, every breath steady. My heels clicked softly across the marble floor, each sound an exclamation mark. The room stayed silent. Some guests nodded in respect. Others watched as if they were witnessing something sacred. Walking away wasn't weakness. Walking away was peace. Peace over poison. Behind me, the ballroom remained full of broken illusions, stained with their downfall. Ahead of me, the cool night air opened like a promise. I stepped outside without once looking back. The horizon was beginning to pale, the first streaks of dawn painting the Ohio sky. I got into my car, the silence inside wrapping around me like a cloak. As I drove away from the country club, the rising sun followed me. 10 years of carrying shame, silence, and the weight of their lies dissolved with every mile I put between us. I whispered to myself, I was once the erased child. Now I am the author of my own story. Family is not defined by who claims you. It is defined by who values you. And for the first time, I belonged. To myself.